Welcome to the Interlocutor Podcast. I'm Tyrel Cameron Eskelson. My guest today is Dennis Hayes. Dennis is Emeritus Professor of Education at the University of Derby. In 2006, he founded the campaign group Academics for Academic Freedom. He's also the co-author of the book, The Dangerous Rise of Therapeutic Education. He joins me today for a discussion about education and academic freedom in the UK. Dennis, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me.
I'd like to start by asking you about your background in teaching in schools and how that experience has helped or informed the way that you write and think about education today.
Well, I came into higher education quite late. So my career started in teaching English in secondary schools, and then I moved to teach in special schools, which was interesting because I was influenced by a philosopher, Herbert Cole, who'd written a small book called Teaching the Unteachable about his work in Harlem. And I thought this sounds more interesting than just teaching English literature forever. So I moved into special education, and then into further education and teacher training. So most of my time in education has been spent as a teacher trainer and educator. So that was largely at Canterbury Christ Church University, which is within the walls of Canterbury. It's a beautiful place, but has a Christian ethos. We had a very large program there, and it was very interesting. How it influenced me is that we could never agree in our team about what we should say to students, to the trainees. So we wrote a book, and it's called Teaching and Training in Post-Compulsory Education. And now it's had many different titles, and it's in its 5th edition. And a bestseller, I have to say. We actually got compound interest from the publishers, which was the Open University Press, and then McGraw-Hill took it over. But so what we did, we say, do you see yourself as a teacher or an educator? Do you see yourself as a facilitator? How do you see education? So we never sort of told them what to think, but put forward ideas that said, think for yourself. We were criticised for it at first because we used a lot of the old philosophers of education from the 1960s. And people say, what do you want this old stuff? Why don't you just tell us how to meet all the new regulations? Well, we didn't do that. So that's part of its usefulness and success, because it was prefaced on debate. And that came out really of my experiences in various environments. But it wasn't just my professional background that influenced me, because while I was teaching in Christchurch, we went and did a second study of Basildon. So it was published in 2002 as Basildon, the Mood of the Nation. And we interviewed 500 people in Basildon, which has more skilled workers than any other town in the UK. So it's unique. It's like Peoria in the United States. Bellwether constituency for elections. And what we found is that people were not as sociologists would expect them. So they were very ambitious, very keen on education, and very keen on doing things for themselves. We called them Mr. Aspiration. So the idea was that you should aspire to achieve a really good education. It came into conflict with lots of people. The local MP at the time was very keen on banning fox hunting. And Basildon's a huge outer London new town, the last and largest of the new towns with Ford factories. Fox hunting is not a big issue with the constituents. Well, they're very keen on cars, which we weren't allowed to do. We don't want cars, we want car parking. But they were very keen on these things. Somebody described Basildon as a little bit of America in Essex, which is true. It had that sort of aspirational feel about it. So when I started researching education more, went in the teacher training process, we discovered in the early 2000s that there was a whole series of sessions with emotional things. So in the early 2000s, everybody was talking about self-esteem. Every reality show person was talking about how their self-esteem had been damaged. And then it changed. So from self-esteem, it became emotional intelligence. We need to get people to be more emotionally intelligent. So some of the schools, when I was in Kent, some of the schools are grammar schools and some are secondary schools, community schools. And whilst the grammar schools were still teaching Latin and all the core subjects, the secondary schools have moved to emotional intelligence. So the working classes, if you like, were getting instead emotional intelligence rather than real intellectual challenge. And then from then it went on to mindfulness. There was a period when mindfulness was everything, and then it just kept changing. But it was always about your emotions. So education became to focus more and more on the internal pupil or student, and then well-being, and now mental health. Mental health has really focused this. Everybody has a mental health problem. I went recently for an asthma check, and normally they do things like check your blood pressure, and all the questions were about my mental health. And they said, do you have a stressful life? Well, as I run AFAF, a campaign of free speech, yes, I have a stressful life. And do you ever get angry? Yes. Viciously angry, but for good reasons. But they wanted me to say that, I was really upset and I really needed counselling, which I, don't need. So Cameron Eskelson was writing about similar things about self-esteem, and we worked together on the book, The Dangerous Rise of Therapeutic Education. An interesting story is, it went to the Open University Press. They were very keen on publishing it, and it was turned down, much to the annoyance of the commissioning editor, because they said a book about therapy in schools would make more money than a book that was criticising therapy in schools. So they rejected it. So she gave us all the reviews, and we took it to Routledge, and they snapped it up. So and now it's been republished as a classic edition. But we went through all the different disciplines to show that everybody was being treated as if they were what we called a diminished human being. So we have lots and lots of examples. I mean, even from early years. I mean, I can give you some examples. Some are quite funny. One of the examples of a little boy, we call him Mark, came into a class and they were sitting around talking about, well, you seem very happy today. He said, yes, it's my birthday, and I'm going to this, and I'm going to McDonald's. Big mistake to tell the teacher you're going to McDonald's. And the teacher keeps pressing this poor kid and says, is there nothing that's worrying you? So, you're not allowed to be happy and enthusiastic. But the best example I got from a friend of mine was her son didn't like peas. So he used to say, she'd say, eat your peas or you're not, having a pudding. And he'd say, I feel very uncomfortable having to eat these peas. And they picked up the therapeutic language. And I think we did make a small, not a mistake. We downplayed the effect of therapeutic education on universities when we wrote the first edition of the book. Came out in 2008-9. Because at that time we thought, well, universities, they're the places where you pursue knowledge without fear or favour. They're not going to adopt to all this. 10 years on, of course, the whole thing had changed, and universities were the focus of promoting therapeutic education. Freshers' Week had been replaced by Welcome Week. Everybody got counselling about any issue. More and more people were diagnosed with ADHD, with anxiety, with dyslexia, and everybody wanted some badge to wear that said, I've got this issue. And sometimes, cynically, they may do it to get extra time or computing. But it's the idea that you look at yourself as inwardly more than outwardly. We had a very good quote from a teacher we used at the front of the book, and it was Mike Taylor, was a secondary school teacher in South London at the time. And he said, something has changed when students want to know more about themselves than the world. And that, diminished idea of a human being, that you've got to be concerned about your emotions and feelings. Universities and schools really went to town on this because it's something they could offer. They had to promote this, you probably know this, they have to promote the student experience as a part of their funding, and they have to have the National Student Survey, which has just come out, and everybody's poring over it now to make sure the students have said they're happy, basically, because that's what it amounts to. And so they reorganise themselves around lots of therapeutic activities. And sometimes it's almost funny. We went to one university in the north and I collect the leaflets. They give out leaflets for students. And one said, if you come to this university and you do nursing, you might find that a lot of people are ill. So you might need therapy. And if you come to the university and you just who study sociology, you might find that a lot of people are poor. See where this is going. So you might need therapy. So basically, whatever you came to university to study, it might upset you. And there are all the laughing things about people, putting trigger warnings on Shakespeare and Dracula and various things. But I think it has a more substantial impact on the students because they start to look inward rather than outward. And that makes it very difficult. And that creates the climate where you can't really discuss anything because there's a real twist in the therapeutic education, because when we talk to people when the book first came out, and people in some sessions actually cried because they thought we were damaging pupils and students. But we're actually doing the opposite. We want them to achieve the maximum potential, and that means intellectually, and not to be just constantly concerned about their emotions. I think it seems cruel because people you may not know anything about Plato or history, but you know about your own feelings. You're the authority on how you're feeling. So the new authority was the authority of feelings, or people who were looking after feelings, and it really meant you couldn't be challenged. So if you, if you're upset, I'm going to ask you why you're upset and why you do it. We have just been looking at universities, as you may know. There's the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act that came into place it was 2023, but it's been delayed and cut. But it now has requirements that universities must accept that students have got to be challenged and even offended. And so you can't censor people for challenging people's views, which is sort of welcome. The university will try in every way they can to get around it. They get the lawyers on it, but at least it's a step forward to challenge the idea that if you're offended, then we must look after you. But we discovered one university that's changed the rules. They recognise this, students must be offended, but then they say, but what if they're distressed? So we replace offence with distress. And then what it says, it's a great example for me, is you basically turn your teaching session into a therapy session to make sure that they feel safe. So instead of teaching Plato, you spend all your time dealing with this person's distress. You just can't stop it. The therapeutic thing, the latest aspect of this is compassion. Universities are promoting compassion. You should be teaching people to be compassionate. And one way it seems nice, it seems caring, but it's caring contempt because it's denying students and young people the possibility of an intellectual life. Because we're constantly concerned about their mental health. And it's no wonder that so many thousands of people are now unable to work because of mental health issues in the UK. And so it affects the workplace as well. I think at the back of all my campaigning for academic freedom is this idea that you must challenge the claim that I'm being offended, therefore, I'm not engaging with the discussion, I'm not engaging with you. And that, to me, promotes the diminished human being. So that's my major criticism of, which not a lot of people agree with, of course. People have different views. People think it's buying into the therapy culture idea, but it's there. And the way we prove it in the book is through thousands of examples. And I still collect them. Like one of the more recent ones, and I'll stop with my examples after this, is at London School of Economics. There's a poster on the wall that has Overcoming Perfectionism. And it offers a course because you come to the London School of Economics and you might, want to go home and become Prime Minister. You might want to change the world. And this may cause you distress. You see where this is going. When you lower your ambitions. And the Oxford School for Girls did a Death of Little Miss Perfect, same sort of thing. Don't try and be perfect. Don't try and achieve. So that's the sort of, if you like, the cultural climate or the anti-cultural climate, really, in which the universities function.
This rise of therapeutic education, you began touching on examples of how that's threatening academic freedom or doing away with academic freedom. Back in the early 2000s, say 2004, 5, and 6, what were some of the motivating factors that led you to want to begin your organization, Academics for Academic Freedom?
Well, at the time I was on the Times Higher Education Board and I was writing articles. One was entitled "Here Comes the Touchy-Feely Brigade," which that was their title, not me, but But at the same time, Roy Harris, who was emeritus professor of general linguistics at Oxford, was writing similar things, but more, if you like, more hard. One of his articles was speaking out for the right to speak evil. Whatever you speak, you must challenge it, because that's what academia is about. So we were writing these, and then he got in touch with me one day and said, well, what are we going to do about it? We keep writing articles. There's still people are writing the same things today. So we met in Oxford, and Roy Harris is very intellectual, and, it made your brain hurt over 3 hours. We debated what to do. And eventually we rewrote the standard statement of academic freedom that's contained in English educational law. And we just wrote this very simple statement that said, academics, both inside and outside the classroom, have unrestricted liberty to question and test received wisdom, and to put forward controversial and unpopular opinions, whether or not these are deemed offensive. And academic institutions have no right to curb the exercise of this freedom by members of their staff, or to use it as a grounds for disciplinary action or dismissal. So we thought, let's get academics to sign up to this. And it hit the headlines in probably a lull period in December 2006. The Times Higher run a front page article saying academics demand the right to be offensive. Well, we don't demand the right to be offensive. Quite important distinction. We say, whether or not our views are offensive, we want the right to put them forward. But it hit the headlines, and it went on, and we did some academic work. Amazingly, lots of people still write to me and say, can I sign it anonymously? You see, the whole point of it is, it says, we want academics to make a public statement of your commitment to free speech, and we want to put free speech back at the heart of academia. Academics are really keen on their research projects and getting grants and writing monographs and pouring out things for the research excellence framework, and you get to get your 3 or 4 articles out so they get assessed and the university gets more money. But the free speech aspect of it, they're not that keen on, because if you have free speech, you can challenge academics, you can challenge the views they're putting forward, even within a discipline or cross-discipline. So we got a lot of people to sign up, not many, but then what happened is, you can imagine, lots of people came to us for help. And we've got some good lawyers who work pro bono for us, and we don't pay them. And this is long before the Free Speech Union came into existence. And so we did lots and lots of casework. And we have the banned list. If you look on our website, it's quite often quoted. But that's the tip of the iceberg. They're only the public cases that we can mention. So a lot of the cases we deal with are internal. People put on disciplinaries for various very trivial reasons. I can give an example that one academic said to his line manager, I feel uncomfortable having to use preferred pronouns, as a recent example, in the classroom. Never said he wouldn't do it, said he'd feel uncomfortable. Then a whole investigation starts happening about his views and so on. And eventually gets a warning, but it takes weeks of time. The process is a punishment in a lot of these cases. People get challenged for what they say. I always say that if there's one thing that shows there's a free speech crisis, not just in British universities or Irish universities, we have branches in Ireland, is that nobody in senior management at university level dares say that biological sex is real. Very simple thing. It's a fact. It's real. They don't say it. Their careers would be over, because all the people they've appointed, the gender ideologists that they've become supportive of, would really attack them. It wouldn't. It's impossible. And I thought, because there was a Supreme Court judgment that you may have heard of that recently, that defined a woman as a biological female. So biological sex is real now, says the British law. We notice in our statement of academic freedom, we don't have academic freedom within the law. Because Roy Harris took that out, because so many laws restricting free speech, hate speech laws. We may have an Islamophobic law soon. So you just have to deal with all these cases that come up. But I mean, a lot of them are confidential, and universities have confidentiality clauses. So if you make them public, it's often another disciplinary offence. 2 disciplinary offences and you're out. So You can imagine all these cases have been going on for years and years and years, and people didn't, so that took our time up, and it still does. We get a case every week about somebody is threatened. And we're not talking, people often think it's lecturers that have just started, new lecturers or researchers. It's not. It's often people at senior professorial levels who get into trouble, because they have a bit more confidence to speak, but they still come after you if you say things. But so we've done lots and lots of casework, but things changed for us in 2022 because Edinburgh University, a very well-known case now, they got in lots of trouble. Neil Thin, because he challenged the renaming of the David Hume Tower. David Hume, the leading Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, challenged the renaming of that, and they had difficulties in trying to get speakers. Some gender-critical women, feminists. Shireen Benjamin talked to me and we said, what should we do? I said, why don't we set up a branch? We don't know what had happened as an experiment. You've got quite a few people form Edinburgh Academics for Academic Freedom. So they did. And it's been a very, very useful and very successful branch. And they hit the headlines many times because they tried to show the film Adult Human Female. And they were not only criticised, they were physically attacked. And it was had three goes at trying to show the film. So that gave a lot of publicity. But then other people started to say, well, can we have a branch? So there's a branch at Derby and then a branch at City University in London, and then Canterbury, Christchurch, Kent, Northumbria, branches everywhere. Dublin, they've got Dublin University's branch, or even an American branch. And it's really good because we don't know we don't require they do anything. We don't ask for money. It's up to them. My idea of, have some aspiration to achieve something, do it yourself. Do whatever you do is good. Right? Some people are shy at doing things. They have more like a book club. Others organise lots of meetings and get into difficulties with meetings. But whatever they do, and recently we've been writing to our branches to say we've got some guidance about how universities should respond to what's left of the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act. And we're sending that around to them and saying, challenge your university on this. And we've got a list of ways in which universities can promote free speech, which we've worked on with the other free speech unions, Alumni for Free Speech, Free Speech Union, and our own, and of course, our own student branch. So in 2024, Heather McKee is described as a flame-herd force of nature by one commentator, set up a student Academics for Academic Freedom branch. And one of our lawyers, who's now a barrister, had originally set up a branch 10, 15 years ago and been quite successful for a while. But then, as students are, they cease to be students and become lecturers and go out into the real world. And he's now one of our barristers, one of our team. But she set it up, and it's now run by Jaden Long, who's a first-year student at Queen Mary, University of London, and Rachel Cutmore at Anglia Ruskin in Cambridge, another first-year student. First-year students setting up free speech branches. It's a unique thing. I don't think any organisation has set up, we've set them up, encouraged the growth of student activity and student branches. That's really exciting, and we've got more coming into being in the next year. But we leave it up to the students to do what they want. Some are very formal, some are more informal. But they're creating an atmosphere where people know there's not only organisations made up of academics and free speech campaigners, but also students are fighting for free speech and academic freedom, which is a major step forward in the fight for free speech.
You mentioned the name Roy Harris earlier. I wrote a quote down from that article you mentioned, and I wanted to read it and just have your reaction. It was the one sentence in it that I thought was most powerful. It says, a free society is not one that can or should offer guarantees against prejudice, propaganda, criticism, antagonism, or conflict. If you want such immunity, you do not want to live in a free society. I thought that was a pretty powerful statement of things.
That's true. I mean, I agree with that. It's just that the move that people always make for things they don't like is to try and cancel it and censor it and become unfree. And that's the issue. I said to you, I'm writing a book called The Death of Academic Freedom, ? And one of the things I really look at is, well, as well as the usual things about who's getting banned and censored, but the whole intellectual movement to cancel, to close down debate and discussion. And you can see it in various scenarios. I mean, the Palestine issue is one. I said last year at our annual conference that defending free speech is going to be messier than it's ever been, because you have to defend the free speech of people whose views you utterly loathe. So it's not. And there was a meeting I was at with lots of students, free speech, and somebody said, "Would you stop people shouting from the river to the sea on the streets of London?" A third of the room put their hands up. That tells you something had changed. These are the free, not AFAF people, but they were free speech. You have to defend the right of that. It doesn't mean you have to agree with it. And people often think, oh, you're giving them a platform. You're allowing them to say, and then all sorts of things will happen. Well, no, you're not. It's really good to know who these people are, who are the ones who are promoting evil, to use Roy's phrase. But it is hard to do it, and it's, I've people, if you're Jewish, you might want to censor all these things. So, if you want to say anything about October the 7th, you find in universities there are people who quite often deny the impact of October the 7th, or say it was less than it was, it's all Israeli propaganda. And you have to fight these views. And you have to fight the views of people who want a caliphate in Britain, or whatever, but you don't censor them, you don't stop them. You have to let them speak. I'd rather know who they are. And people will always say yes, but the borderline is always when it comes over from speech to action. And I always blame Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., a name etched on most American academics' hearts. In 1919, he made a Supreme Court judgment in Schenck, as well known, and he said the most stringent protection of free speech would not protect a man falsely shouting fire in a crowded theatre and causing a panic. That's been reinterpreted as shouting fire in a crowded theatre and causing panic. But what's that got to do with free speech? Because he aligns action and speech. The example I always give is pressing a fire alarm in a crowded theatre, cinema, causing panic. What is the speech element? Obviously, there is speech there. This is a speech act. Fire, but it's no different than an alarm. So pressing a fire alarm is an act. And so people have gone on to say, there's some speech that must be restricted. It's interesting, another free speech statement by Justice Louis D. Brandeis. I would say Louis, but you can't say it, Brandeis. In Whitney versus California 2077, responded to this and said, the remedy to apply it, if there's time, is more speech. More speech. So you don't censor, you don't enforce silence, you allow more speech. And of course that runs against the grain of lots of activists who say the debate is over. The number of times I gave a talk at the Oxford Union 2 years ago, I think it was, and at the end somebody said, well, I believe in free speech, but not about climate change. And there's always something, I always say, the test of anybody, you can say, do you believe in free speech? And they'll say, yes, I believe in free speech. And then you wait for the but. You always wait for the but. There'll always be a but. But there's a funny thing about buts. It deletes the first part of the sentence. Because if I believe in free speech, but not for Islamists, not for these people, not for Tommy Robinson, whatever it is, then you don't believe in free speech. Why not just say it? I don't believe in free speech. That's what you should say, rather than pretend. And it is galling for me. Sometimes I was listening to some famous people who defend free speech, and they often start out by saying, there's no such thing as absolute free speech. I was interviewed by somebody who said, well, I've never met anybody who believes in absolute free speech. Well, so you've met one now. The issue is that when people say that, really, all they're saying is they don't believe in free speech. So they stick the word absolute on and think, well, nobody would, there must be some cases where you would never allow free speech. And the usual case comes up, incitement to violence. And even that, is something that Roy has challenged and other people have challenged, because it has this sort of diminished sense of human being about it as well, that human beings are like attack dogs. So I stand up and say, burn down that building. And everybody says, oh, that's a good idea, Dennis. And they all go and burn it down. If that's not what happens, A, they've got a moral conscience, they can think. And B, if they do that, it's not my fault, it's theirs. They went and did it. I think that's that's the sort of thing you have to argue about. It's not the limits of free speech, it's push them as far as you can, because otherwise you start restricting lots of other speech. So they make these gentle statements, there's no such thing as absolute free speech, but that's coded for let's not really have free speech, just the free speech we like. And what about incitement to violence? Well, let's try and push back even on that, because and the other thing that people will always say is the law says, the law says you mustn't incite violence, the law says you mustn't hate, the law says lots of things you're not allowed to do. So I think you also need to challenge people who believe only in free speech within the law, because we're talking about speech here, not action. And eliding action, which Oliver Wendell Holmes did, is at the basis of the problem. Let's stick back to free speech, because there's two things about free speech that I always say. First of all, it has to be free. Right? It's simple. No restrictions on free speech. It has to be free. And it must be about speech. Free speech. It's about speech and not about action or elided with action. And that's the battle that has to be fought still. Even campaigners on free speech, we all disagree. We have 1,600 people in our network and we don't all agree about anything. As academics always disagree, and we can disagree, but still get on with one another and argue about what we believe in.
In 2025, what are some things that Academics for Academic Freedom are involved in? I know you have your annual conference or annual meetings coming up in, is it November?
Yes, in November.
And what are some other things that are going on with you in the organization this year that you're keeping an eye on?
Well, every branch will be having meetings, and we're asking all our branches to make sure that the universities promote free speech. We have these 10 points, which is basically make sure you've got a website. So when people log on to the university website, it says free speech, and this is our free speech section of the website. You find things, and to ensure that you have a free speech officer, people who are looking after free speech in universities, and that you try and adopt institutional neutrality. These are all intellectual battles, really, that we're fighting, and try and ensure that you have the students are bound by your free speech regulations, because the law and the Labour government took unions out of the law, so students' unions are not affected by any of the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act regulations, and also to report on what you're doing. So we just take up these intellectual challenges. So what we're going to do is debating things like freedom of speech within the law. So rather than just having controversial debates, people like this idea, let's have controversial debates about whatever we can think of, trying to have debates about all these issues. And we're going over to Ireland. We're meeting in University College Dublin about the impact of Athena Swan. There's two things that are major issues in universities in Ireland are the requirement for Athena Swan to adopt gender ideology. And of course, then the EU is pushing hate speech laws and challenges in the Irish Parliament about what constitutes a woman. So we take all these issues. So it's not random debates, but we try and work out what are the important issues for each branch. And quite a few branches that want to challenge decolonisation, where they're ordered to decolonise their curriculum, which really means nothing more than bringing a lot of modern, rather poor quality texts that deal with issues like whiteness, rather than classic works by C.L.R. James on really good African writers. It doesn't mean that. It just means bring in some politics. So we're challenging all these things, and I think it's very healthy. We do also have a really good working relationship with the other unions, not unions, the other free speech groups, the Free Speech Union, Alumni for Free Speech, and others, and that's quite healthy as well. So, but most academics have been focusing on the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, so they put all their hopes into making it effective. But they've taken away the tort, so you can't sue your university if you feel that your free speech rights have been infringed. But so I think we have to return this next year to the cultural battle, which is to get people not to be frightened to sign the AFAF statement, not be too frightened to speak up, but speak up. Because in the end, whatever regulations you have, you've got the First Amendment to the American Constitution, that should make no restrictions on freedom of the press and so on. But they still have restrictions on free speech everywhere, and they're still fighting. So I think we've got to really focus on the cultural battle, if you like, the battle to make every individual have the aspiration to personally defend free speech. That brings me back to being Mr. Aspiration, we're going to say to every academic and student, sorry, we can't say Mr. or Mrs. or Ms. Aspiration, and try to do your bit to defend free speech. No ifs, no buts.
Right. Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today and enjoyed learning more about AFAF and also about your career. So thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.